They owned almost nothing, lived in dirt floor huts, and worked from sunrise to nightfall. Yet medieval peasants survived centuries of hardship, war, famine, and plague. How? Not just with grit, but with genius. Hidden in their barns, kitchens, and fields were storage tricks so clever, modern science is still catching up. From preserving milk without refrigeration to keeping grain safe for years, these forgotten hacks reveal a raw intelligence shaped by survival. This isn't just history. It's proof that brilliance doesn't require wealth. Medieval Europe was a world without convenience. No electricity, no refrigeration, no running water. For the vast majority, those who worked the land, survival was a daily battle against cold, hunger, and time itself. These peasants, who made up nearly 90% of the population, lived in small villages scattered across the countryside, their homes built from timber, mud, and thatch. A failed harvest could mean starvation, a cold winter, death. Yet, against this backdrop of hardship, medieval peasants developed systems of resilience. They didn't have access to formal education or written manuals, but they observed, tested, and passed down knowledge through generations. Their lives depended on it. Every season brought different challenges. With no access to refrigeration, they had to find ways to store food across long winters. Without metal containers or industrial packaging, they used clay, ash, straw, wool, and animal skin materials drawn directly from their surroundings. Trial and error wasn't a scientific method. It was a necessity. If storing root vegetables in straw kept them from rotting, the method was remembered. If a clay-sealed jar preserved butter longer, it was repeated. Over time, these experiments formed a practical science passed not through books but by memory, ritual, and example. Children learned from elders and neighbors from one another. Most of it wasn't recorded, but it persisted because it worked. Their survival strategies were tightly bound to the natural world. They knew the shifting moods of the soil, the temperature fluctuations inside a thatch roof cottage, the smells that signaled decay. They watched animals and mimicked their instincts, burying, hanging, drying, without understanding bacteria. They had an intuitive sense of rot, fermentation, and preservation. These were not backward or ignorant people. They were adaptive, community-driven. In the absence of wealth, they developed collective solutions. Villages often shared ovens, smokehouses, and granaries. Labor was communal. So was knowledge. What emerges from the historical record is not a story of helplessness, but of ingenuity. A peasant might never leave their village, but within their limited world, they refined practices that kept them and their families alive. These practices, many of which modern science would later validate, show that intelligence isn't measured by tools or titles, but by adaptation to one's environment. Beneath the floorboards of medieval cottages and scattered across the surrounding fields lay one of the most important tools in the peasant's struggle for survival: earth, or more specifically, the stable, cool environment beneath it. Long before the advent of refrigeration, medieval communities across Europe learned to use the ground itself as a natural preservative. Food storage wasn't an afterthought, it was a central part of staying alive through harsh winters, unpredictable harvests, and long periods of scarcity. Root cellars and underground pits were some of the most common and effective storage methods. By digging below the frost line, usually around 1 to 2 meters deep, depending on local climate, peasants took advantage of the Earth's insulation. In most regions of Europe, subterranean temperatures stayed relatively constant throughout the year, often between 4 to 10 degrees Celsius, cool enough to slow rot, dark enough to prevent sprouting, and most importantly, out of reach from sunlight, predators, and pests. Inside these cellars, they didn't simply pile vegetables or cured meats. They used natural materials as insulation. Layers of straw cushioned turnips, parsnips, and carrots, absorbing moisture and protecting them from bruising. Sand served as a breathable buffer that helped regulate humidity. In some areas, ash was poured around certain items, not just for insulation, but because it deterred insects and small animals. The ash created a dry, hostile environment for decay. Some cottages had storage pits dug directly into the floors, covered by wooden boards or slabs of stone. These hidden cavities provided immediate access to preserved goods. Other homes had separate cellar spaces built just outside, often shared between extended families or small clusters of households. In wetter regions, cellars were sometimes lined with stone to prevent cave-ins or flooding. Where stone wasn't available, timber or wattle reinforcements were used beyond individual homes. Larger villages developed communal storage practices. In places like Anglo-Saxon England or Carolingian Francia, evidence points to shared granaries and smokehouses, centralized structures where villagers could store grain or smoked meats under collective watch. These communal systems not only preserved food but strengthened local bonds. In small settlements where isolation could mean death, shared infrastructure helped distribute risk across households. The archaeological record shows that many of these storage systems were refined over generations. Soil was tested, drainage was adjusted, openings were sealed tighter as rodents found their way in. In parts of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, earth mounds were even built over storage pits to provide added insulation and wind protection. Seasonal cycles were synchronized with these methods. Vegetables harvested in late summer went straight underground. The goal was clear: make it last until spring. These practices weren't unique to one region. Similar techniques appear across medieval France, the Germanic kingdoms, the Slavic lands, and even in the isolated mountain villages of the Alps. Each had local variations, but the core idea remained the same. Survival depended on using the environment with precision. In an age where losing a crop could mean famine, these underground solutions weren't primitive. They were strategic. The cold ground, the breathable straw, the dry ashel worked together to buy time. And in medieval Europe, time was often the difference between hunger and endurance. Without refrigeration, preserving meat was one of the most critical challenges faced by medieval peasants. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, especially during warmer months. Sand hunting was inconsistent. Livestock could not be slaughtered randomly. Every kill had to be calculated, knowing that once the flesh was exposed, time was limited. The answer came through methods that were simple in execution but deeply effective: smoking, salting, and air drying. These preservation techniques varied slightly across regions, but their fundamentals remained consistent across Europe. Salt was the most valuable and widely used resource for this task. In fact, entire economies revolved around it. Towns like Lüneburg, in present-day Germany, and the coastal city of Venice built trade wealth on salt production. In medieval England, the Domesday Book of 1086 records the importance of inland salthouses near places like Droitwich. Salt was not just a preservative, it was a commodity, taxed, traded, and guarded. To cure meat with salt, the katsush, pork or fish, were packed tightly in barrels, layered with coarse, dry salt. The salt drew moisture from the flesh through osmosis, creating an environment hostile to bacterial growth. Depending on the size and thickness, the process could last from several days to weeks. After curing, the meat could be hung to dry further, or smoked, especially in the colder months when air was naturally drier and insects less active. Smokehouses were common in peasant villages, although wealthier manors often had more advanced structures dedicated to this process. These buildings were simply usually wooden or stone-walled sheds with no chimneys. Meat would be hung from beams above a low, smoldering fire. The smoke was kept cool and continuous, rising slowly to envelop the meat. This was known as cold smoking. In other cases, warmer fires would be used for a shorter hot smoking method, though this had to be carefully managed to avoid cooking the meat prematurely. The smoke acted as a preservative in multiple ways. It dried the surface of the meat, created a barrier to insects, and infused it with antimicrobial compounds like formaldehyde and phenols. Different types of wood oak, beech, alder gave off varying properties. Hardwoods were preferred. Pine or resinous trees could make the food bitter or toxic. Fish, particularly in coastal and river-rich regions, followed similar preservation routines. In Norway and northern Scotland, for instance, cod and herring were heavily salted and then dried on wooden racks in the open air, forming part of a tradition that would evolve into stockfishing, export product that fed Europe for centuries. In the Baltic and North Seas, smoked eel and herring were dietary staples, consumed inland after months of storage. These methods weren't just functional, they became seasonal rituals. Winter preparations often centered around butchering livestock. In late autumn, when temperatures dropped and preservation conditions were ideal, families gathered to process entire animals in a single day, hanging hams and sausages in attic spaces or smokehouses for the cold months ahead. In Catholic regions, salted fish became central to the diet during Lent, reinforcing preservation as a religious and cultural necessity. By preserving food through salt, smoke, and air, medieval peasants extended the lifespan of their harvests and livestock far beyond the slaughter. In a world where food scarcity was never far away, these methods didn't just keep people fed, ensured continuity through famine, war, and isolation. In medieval households, where tools were few and perishables spoiled quickly, preservation depended on two unlikely materials, clay and ash. Both were abundant, inexpensive, and remarkably effective. Across much of Europe, they became central to daily survival. Clay pots, often pit-fired in local kilns or even simple open fires, were among the most accessible storage vessels. They varied in shape and thickness, depending on region and purpose. Unglazed earthenware was porous, allowing for slow evaporation that kept contents cool. Glazed pottery, a technology that spread gradually from the Islamic world into Europe by the 9th and 10th centuries, offered a more sealed environmental deal for holding liquids and dairy. Butter, milk, and soft cheese, all prone to rapid spoilage, were commonly stored in these containers. But the real preservation trick came not just from the clay, but from what sealed it: ash. Wood ash, a byproduct of daily hearth fires, had antiseptic properties. When layered on top of stored food, it formed a dry, alkaline barrier that repelled insects, absorbed moisture, and hindered bacterial growth. Butter packed tightly into jars could be topped with ash and kept in a cool place for weeks, sometimes months. In parts of France and Central Europe, dairy was also preserved in ash-lined crocks. Ash created a crust that hardened over time, shielding the contents from direct air exposure This method was especially effective when paired with slightly salted butter or cheese, which further inhibited spoilage. In some traditions, layers of food and ash were alternated, especially for preserving eggs or semi-soft cheese. Archaeological digs in rural England, Scandinavia, and the Low Countries confirm widespread use of ash in domestic storage through the 12th and 13th centuries. Wax was another sealing method, though less common among the poorest households due to its higher value. Beeswax, when available, was melted and poured over jars to create a protective cap, particularly for preserving fruits or fermented dairy. Unlike ash, wax provided a near airtight seal and could be reused if kept clean. The use of clay and ash wasn't accidental. Over time, medieval people developed an intuitive understanding of their properties. Ash from hardwoods, like oak or beech, was preferred. It burned cleaner and produced a finer, more consistent material. Pottery evolved to match preservation needs. Narrow necks helped reduce air contact. Wide bodies made layering easier. In monastic records from the 11th century, especially from Benedictine orders known for agricultural innovation, detailed instructions on preserving food in clay vessels appear with surprising precision. This combination of clay, ash, and occasionally wax allowed communities to store food beyond the immediate season. It wasn't refrigeration, but it was control. And in a world without machines, control over time was everything. These low-tech methods formed the backbone of rural food storage for centuries, shaping not only how medieval people ate, but how they planned, traded, and endured. Grain wasn't just food, it was insurance. For medieval peasants, grain determined survival across seasons, taxation burdens, and even their place within the local economy. Whether barley, rye, oats, or wheat, grain was the foundation of daily life used for bread, porridge, ale, and feed. Its protection became a year-round priority, especially in a society without synthetic pesticides, sealed silos, or climate-controlled storage. After harvest, the first priority was drying. Even slightly damp grain could rot within weeks. Threshing floors, usually packed earth or stone, were used to separate the edible parts from husk and stalk. But drying didn't end there. In regions prone to sudden rainfall or dense mourning, fog, sheaves were often stacked in temporary structures known as stooks or ricks, angled to allow airflow. Timing was critical. A poorly timed harvest could ruin a year's food supply. Once dry, grain was stored in elevated granaries. These structures, raised on wooden or stone stilts, had a specific purpose: to keep the grain out of reach of rodents, and to maintain ventilation underneath. In Anglo-Saxon England, granaries known as burns featured slatted floors and small gaps between planks to allow air circulation. In Scandinavia, similar raised barns called stabber continued to be used into the early modern period. The elevation not only protected against mice and rats, but also against ground moisture, which could lead to mold. Rodents, however, remained a constant threat. Poison was rare and dangerous to store near food, so peasants turned to natural deterrents. Mint and elder were commonly planted around granaries. Their strong odors acted as repellents. In Eastern Europe, tansy and wormwood were scattered near storage sites, while in parts of the British Isles, dried rue was hung from ceilings or stuffed into cracks. Cats were also encouraged to remain near storage buildings, not as pets, but as pest control. Moisture remained the most unpredictable danger. Mold could spread silently through a grain sack, rendering the contents not just useless, but poisonous. Ergot, a fungus that thrived in damp rye, caused hallucinations and gangrene, and was later linked to mass poisonings across Europe. To test for moisture, peasants used practical, physical checks. One method involved biting the grain. If the kernel cracked sharply, it was dry. If it dented, it was still too moist. Another check involved tossing a handful into a wooden bowl. If the grain bounced or rolled loosely, it passed. Layering was another safeguard. In regions of France and the Germanic states, dried straw was spread between layers of stored grain to absorb residual humidity and maintain airflow. Sometimes herbs were mixed into the straw for added pest resistance. Grain was stored in sacks, clay jars, or wooden bins, depending on local materials and wealth. Larger manors often had dedicated granaries, while village peasants shared space or maintained smaller structures behind their homes. Oral tradition played a vital role. Warnings against storing damp grain, advice on herb combinations, and omens tied to rodent sightings were passed through generations. In Slavic folklore, dreams of mold were seen as a sign of future loss. In parts of medieval Italy, it was believed that whistling near stored grain invited mildew. Whether based in science or superstition, these warnings were taken seriously because experience had proven their consequences. Protecting grain was not a single task, it was a system, shaped by climate, local fauna, and centuries of hard-earned knowledge. And for the medieval peasant, it meant the difference between hunger and a stored winter. In a world without iceboxes or electric chillers, peasants turned to the coldest sources available, nature itself. Throughout medieval Europe, running streams, deep wells, and compacted snow became practical refrigeration tools, used not by chance but through generations of observation and adaptation. Flowing water was among the most reliable. In villages situated near rivers or springs, peasants used the naturally cool temperature of moving water to slow spoilage. Earthen or wooden containers holding milk, cream, or meat were submerged in shaded sections of streams, often anchored by stones or tied to wooden stakes. The key was movement. Unlike stagnant pools, running water remained cooler and oxygenated, discouraging bacterial growth. In temperate regions, stream water remained near 10 degrees Celsius year-round, sufficient to preserve dairy for several days and prevent fresh meat from turning rancid within hours. Wells served a similar purpose, though with a different technique. In many parts of Western and Central Europe, especially where streams were absent, villagers lowered sealed clay jugs into deep wells. Water at depth retained a consistent temperature, often below 12 degrees Celsius, regardless of the season. Above, narrow-mouthed jugs or ceramic flasks were tied with ropes and suspended halfway down the shaft, close enough to benefit from the coolness but not immersed in water that might contaminate the contents. This method preserved milk, eggs, butter, and even small cuts of meat. The physics behind it was simple, though not consciously articulated at the time. Water absorbed ambient heat more slowly than air. Deep spaces, shielded from sunlight and wind, created microclimates where perishables could last significantly longer. Some well shafts also doubled as makeshift pantries during summer months, particularly in regions of Spain and southern Italy. Winter offered another opportunity for cold. In northern and mountainous regions, villagers collected snow during the coldest weeks of the year and packed it into pits dug into the ground or built beneath barns. These snow pits, often lined with straw or sawdust, served as seasonal coolers. The insulation slowed melting and kept internal temperatures low even as spring approached. Barrels of salted fish, crocks of butter, or bundles of herbs were stacked carefully, separated by insulating layers to prevent moisture buildup. In alpine villages, this practice evolved into early ice houses by the late Middle Ages. Structures, partially buried into hillsides, filled with tightly packed snow or ice harvested from frozen lakes, were used to preserve perishables through summer months, especially by wealthier estates or monasteries managing large food supplies. Beyond these physical methods, evaporative cooling played a quieter role. Unglazed clay pots left in breezy, shaded areas cooled their contents through natural evaporation. As moisture seeped through the pores and evaporated, it drew heat away, lowering internal temperatures. While subtle, this effect was enough to extend the life of liquids and soft cheese during the mild months. These techniques weren't crude improvisations. They were tested, repeated, and passed down with precision. In communities where food scarcity was always near, nature's cold spaces became a lifeline marked by technology, but engineered by necessity. In medieval Europe, sweetness was rare. Sugar was imported, expensive, and largely reserved for the wealthy. But honey harvested from wild hives or managed in simple woven skepsels, more widely available, and its role extended far beyond taste. Honey was used to preserve. Its natural properties made it ideal. Honey is hygroscopic, draws moisture from its surroundings. Its low water content, combined with acidity and natural hydrogen peroxide production, creates an environment hostile to bacteria and mold. Meat submerged in raw honey could be kept for extended periods without spoiling. Historical records from regions like Saxony, Normandy, and parts of the Slavic lands reference honey storage not only as a luxury but as a practical tool, particularly in the absence of salt or smoke. Small game birds or cuts of cooked meat were occasionally layered in clay jars and covered completely in honey, creating an airtight antiseptic seal. When reopened weeks or even months later, the contents were not only preserved but often infused with sweetness. Archaeological finds from early medieval settlements in present-day Poland and Russia show traces of beeswax and honey residues in ceramic vessels stored underground. Consistent with food preservation use, alongside honey, animal fat served a similar function. Known today as confit in French culinary tradition, the practice of submerging cooked meat in its own rendered fat had widespread medieval roots. Once meat was slow-cooked and cooled, it was sealed beneath a layer of fat, which hardened as it cooled. This fat barrier prevented air from reaching the contents, blocking microbial activity. Peasants, especially in colder climates, stored duck, goose, or pork in this way through the winter months. Fat was accessible and reusable, scraped off, melted down, and poured again as needed. Beeswax, another byproduct of honey production, was employed for sealing. Though more precious due to its value in candle making and trade, it had practical kitchen uses. In southern Europe and parts of the Mediterranean, fruits preserved in syrup or oil were sometimes sealed with a layer of melted beeswax. This wax cap formed a solid lid over jars and crocks, protecting against both air and pests. Records from Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries in the 12th and 13th centuries document this technique in their kitchen inventories. These preservation methods weren't unique to one region, they traveled from Arab apothecaries in Al-Andalus to Slavic homesteads in Kiev and Rus. Honey and fat were used not only to preserve, but to transport. Soldiers and merchants carried jars sealed in beeswax, ensuring a portable food source over long distances. Refined over time, the principle remains unchanged. Modern survivalists and long-term preppers still recognize honey as a shelf-stable food with antimicrobial qualities, and the practice of sealing food in fat remains part of traditional culinary methods across rural Europe. In a world that lacked refrigeration, preservation was a constant concern, and these natural shields, honey, fat, and beeswax, proved that sometimes the most effective solutions were those already found in the hive, the hearth, or the field. Across medieval Europe, the use of herbs went far beyond flavoring meals or treating illness. Peasants working without laboratories or written science recognized that certain plants slowed decay. Through centuries of observation and necessity, they built a system of food preservation that relied on what they could grow, gather, or trade. And often, these methods worked. Herbs like rosemary, thyme, sage, garlic, juniper, and bay were among the most common. Each had natural antimicrobial or antifungal properties. When food was stored, whether dried, smoked, salted, or packed in clay, these herbs were often layered between portions or added to storage containers. In England and the Germanic territories, rosemary and thyme were frequently laid between cuts of meat to deter flies and bacteria. These herbs contain compounds like thymol and carnosic acid, which modern science now confirms inhibit microbial growth. But in the Middle Ages, the understanding was practical. Meat lasted longer and spoiled less often when stored with certain plants. Garlic was a staple in many regions, not only for flavor, but for its powerful preservative qualities. In parts of Eastern Europe, cloves of garlic were crushed and rubbed directly onto meat or mixed into lard before sealing jars. Juniper berries, found across Scandinavia and the Alps, were especially valued when preserving game. Their strong oils helped mask odor and slowed the spread of rot. Salted fish barrels shipped from the North Sea often contained branches of juniper or bay to extend shelf life. Beyond preservation, many of these plants held symbolic or spiritual significance. In France, bundles of sage and rosemary were hung near storage areas not only to repel insects, but as protection against illness, partly rooted in the belief that foul smells carried disease. The same belief led to herbal sachets being worn around the neck during plague outbreaks. These traditions overlapped with food storage. A storage pit that smelled clean was believed to be safer. In Italy and southern Spain, laurel leaves bay were laid at the bottom of grain sacks and jars of legumes. This wasn't just for scent. Bay leaves emit volatile oils that repel weevils and other grain pests. Some rural communities in the Balkans even added lavender to butter crocks or oil jars, a practice passed down for generations despite limited access to writing or formal knowledge systems. Monastic records provide further detail. In herbals compiled by Benedictine and Cistercian monks during the 11th and 12th centuries, preservation methods involving plants appear alongside medicinal uses. These were not separate disciplines. Storage, healing, and survival were part of a single, integrated understanding of nature. The reliance on herbs wasn't superstition, it was an empirical response to a real problem. In a climate where spoilage meant wasted labor and potential hunger, even small extensions of shelf life had real value. These techniques, born of observation, necessity, and tradition, remained embedded in rural life well into the modern era. Preservation, in the medieval world, didn't always mean stopping decay. Sometimes it meant guiding it. Across Europe, peasants learned to harness microbial action, not with microscopes or theory, but through observation and repetition. Instead of avoiding spoilage entirely, They turned it into a controlled transformation. The result was fermentation, and it became one of the most enduring preservation strategies in pre-industrial history. Cheese was among the earliest and most widespread examples. Milk, highly perishable without refrigeration, could be turned into something far more stable. Curdling raw milk, separating the curds from the whey, pressing and salting them. This process transformed liquid into a solid that could be stored, aged, and traded. Monasteries in Normandy, Lombardy, and the Rhineland recorded cheese-making as early as the 9th century. Local variations were tied to geography, available animals, and the microflora of the region. In northern France, soft cheeses thrived in damp climates. In alpine regions, harder cheeses like Emmental and Gruyere were better suited to long-term storage in cool mountain cellars. Cheese production often took place in community settings. Families would pool milk and rotate labor. Seasonal cycles. Matted spring and summer brought abundance, which meant preserving as much as possible before the cold months. The byproduct, whey, didn't go to waste either. It was fed to pigs or used in baking. Fermented vegetables offered another solution. Cabbage, turnips, and root crops were stored in brine, allowing beneficial bacteria to convert sugars into lactic acid. A natural preservative, sauerkraut, widely used in Germanic and Slavic regions, could last for months and even improved in taste over time. The practice was simple but required precision. Crops had to be fresh, salt levels correct, containers clean. Failure meant rot. Success meant access to vitamin-rich food through the winter. Fermentation extended to beverages as well. Ale, mead, and cider were staples, not luxuries. Water was often unsafe, especially in densely populated areas, so lightly fermented drinks became the daily alternative. In England and Flanders, small beer, low in alcohol but rich in calories, was consumed by adults and children alike. In the Baltic and Slavic regions, kvass, a mildly fermented grain drink, served a similar purpose. Fermentation didn't just preserve liquid, it made it safer. Seasonal rhythms dictated everything. The harvest period in late summer wasn't just about collecting crops, it was a race against time. Fermentation allowed peasants to turn perishable food into something that could outlast the frost. Communities developed recipes and methods suited to their environment and passed them down orally, refining them over centuries. These practices weren't static, they evolved. As trade routes opened and monastic knowledge spread, fermentation techniques became more consistent, but they always remained rooted in necessity. In a world where storage failures could mean starvation, fermentation wasn't culinary innovation, it was survival, achieved through patience, timing, and generations of hard-earned knowledge. Storage wasn't just about keeping food safe at home. For medieval peasants, it often had to survive the journey, sometimes from field to cottage, sometimes from one village to the next. In a world without plastic, glass, or even consistent access to pottery, people relied on materials they could source directly from their environment: leather, bark, and wool, animal hide, especially from goats, sheep, and pigs, was commonly used to create pouches, bladders, or tightly bound wraps. Once cleaned, scraped, and dried, these skins were flexible, water-resistant, and durable. Smaller cuts of meat, soft cheese, or bread could be bundled inside, tied with leather cords, and hung over a shoulder or strapped to a cart. In pastoral areas of Wales and the Scottish Highlands, Shepherds often carried provisions wrapped in hide when tending flocks in remote pastures. Records from 13th century tax accounts in northern England list sheepskin wraps among the common items used to transport food from manor estates to markets. Tree bark, particularly from birch and elm, offered another solution. In Scandinavian and Slavic regions, birch bark containers, known as tuhivaka in Finnish, were used to store grains, dried herbs, or foraged berries. These containers were lightweight, resistant to moisture, and could be fashioned without nails or glue. Sections of bark were peeled in spring or early summer when the sap made it pliable. Once shaped and dried, they held their form. Birch bark also contains betulin, a natural antimicrobial compound that helped reduce spoilage. Wool, especially in the form of felted or woven cloth, was used as an insulating layer. It didn't preserve food in isolation, but it protected against temperature swings. Jugs of milk or soft cheese wrapped in damp wool stayed cooler for longer. Using evaporative cooling, particularly useful in warmer regions of southern Europe. In mountainous areas like the Alps, peasants transporting milk to cooperative cheese-making houses would wrap containers in wool-lined baskets to delay curdling during the journey. These materials weren't just convenient, they were reusable, biodegradable, and familiar. Leather could be repaired or reshaped. Bark containers, if cracked, could be patched or composted. Wool wraps were washed, dried, and passed between generations. In an economy of scarcity, nothing was wasted. The very tools of preservation doubled as tools of transport. And while none of these materials could halt spoilage indefinitely, they extended the window long enough to reach safety, trade, or transformation. Not all preservation relied on tools, materials, or containers. A significant part of medieval storage existed only in the mind. Across Europe, in homes with no written records, knowledge was carried in memory, structured, deliberate, and essential. Families developed mental calendars built around the seasons, harvest cycles, and lunar patterns. These calendars dictated not only when to plant or reap, but when to store, when to rotate, and when to inspect. Forgetting could mean the loss of a year's food. In northern France and the Low Countries, for example, it was common knowledge passed down orally that root vegetables had to be moved to storage pits within 3 days of the first hard frost. In the alpine valleys of Switzerland, grain rotation followed a strict sequence, with elder family members marking transitions not on paper, but through verbal instructions tied to feast days or solstices. Children learned early what signs to look for: discoloration in salted meat, the smell of early-stage fermentation in dairy, the faint crack in a grain sack that might mean a rodent breach. These were not casual observations. They were part of household survival. Grandparents passed on cues, sayings, and rituals embedded with practical instruction. In parts of medieval Poland, a moldy scent in a cellar wasn't just a warning. It meant the family had days to act before spoilage spread. The oral tradition extended beyond the home. In villages, community elders remembered long winters, failed harvests, or plagues that affected storage years earlier. They served as a living archive. In regions like Saxony and Tuscany, these communal memories shaped how much grain was kept, how salt was rationed, or whether snow pits would be filled that year. The absence of written instruction didn't mean ignorance, it meant reliance on social memory. Knowledge wasn't hidden in books. It was shared over bread, passed beside ovens, and repeated in fields. Preserving food was more than technique. It was a mental system rehearsed, revised, and respected in the medieval world. Forgetting wasn't just a mistake, it was a risk. Remembering when to dig, when to seal, when to inspect was as important as any cellar or jar. The body stored the harvest, but the mind stored the map. The techniques used by medieval peasants to preserve food weren't primitive. They were solutions engineered under pressure, refined by generations who couldn't afford to waste a single root, egg, or grain. These methods weren't written down, patented, or commercialized. They were passed by memory, tested through necessity, and maintained because they worked in recent decades. Many of these practices have quietly through nostalgia, but through need. In self-sufficiency circles, homesteading communities, and even modern emergency preparedness networks, the same logic applies. No electricity, limited resources, maximum efficiency, storing root vegetables in sand, preserving butter beneath a layer of ash, hanging meat in cold smoke, fermenting vegetables without refrigeration. These aren't historical curiosities. They're being used again, often for the same reasons: uncertainty, rising costs, or distrust in fragile systems. In parts of rural Scandinavia, families still dry fish with juniper smoke, using techniques nearly unchanged since the Middle Ages. In Eastern Europe, cellar storage of apples, onions, and fermented cabbage remains standard practice. Across the Alps, cheese-making continues with seasonal migrations to mountain pastures, timed to old calendars. These aren't reenactments. They're living systems of resilience. Modern technology may offer speed and comfort, but it has also made certain forms of knowledge seem obsolete. When we call something primitive, it's often because we don't understand how well it was adapted to its time and context. Intelligence isn't always about invention. Sometimes it's about recognition, knowing when to work with nature, rather than fight against it. The legacy of medieval food preservation isn't locked in the past. It's alive in the quiet margins and remote farms, in isolated valleys, and increasingly in urban homes turning back to basics. What was once dismissed as old has become relevant again, not because it's fashionable, but because it still works.